Leaders of the free world, 38 of them, descend on Washington, D.C. today to discuss Ukraine, along with the present and future of the NATO alliance. This meeting, meant to mark the alliance's 75th anniversary, comes as Russia launched another attack against Ukraine this week that hit a children's hospital in Kyiv. The NATO summit was supposed to showcase President Biden's leadership. Instead, it will be yet another litmus test of Biden's fitness for a second term. His every move and utterance will be under a microscope. Here to discuss what is at stake and what should be at stake is veteran Jason Beardsley, director of Veterans Initiatives at Stand Together, an organization that unites change makers to figure out solutions for the world's most pressing issues. Thank you for being with us, Jason.
Great to be here. Thank you.
It seems that one of the world's most pressing issues is the president's cognitive health. What's your perspective on how this meeting of world leaders is going to be impacted by the president's current cognitive state and all of the talk about his debate performance?
Well, I think there's a lot of politics that will go into answering that. We're more interested in the policy issues that are behind this. NATO is coming into its 75th year, as you pointed out, Jess, and that marks a particular point in time. It's the right time for policymakers and administrations, whether they be the leaders or those that are the staffs or the ones that are running this, to ask the hard questions with this in mind. Is NATO as effective as it can be, and is it in the right disposition? It starts out as a defensive treaty alliance. Here we are at 75 years. And we're really talking about, as you positioned earlier, some of the aggressive acts that Putin has made and whether there's a counter to that. So are we moving from the defensive part of the alliance to something more offensive? I think those are the important questions really to frame this.
Yeah, the reality of the situation, Russia versus Ukraine, is dire for Ukraine. This war has gone on a long time now. It's been the Biden administration's position to support Ukraine, to send weapons and supplies and money, and say we will defend them until all of Ukraine is retaken, is reheld by the Zelensky government. And we're seeing obvious atrocities, horrors committed by Russia, including this recent attack that resulted in the deaths of children. I think we all want to see that violence come to a swift end. Has NATO and have the U.S. been facilitating a possible end to this tragedy at present?
I think that's one of the better questions to ask here is how do we get to the end point so that we see the post-war atrocities at an end and we come back into some sort of a détente or some sort of representative diplomacy with Russia, with Ukraine. And for that, the United States has led the way in contributions. Defense, we've shorn up about 16% of the NATO budget. We've done about $113 billion of emergency aid in the different forms of direct military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So we've made our commitments clear. But what has not been clear is the articulation of a negotiated settlement. And with all of the influence that the United States brings to the table, we believe, Concerned Veterans for America, that's the best interest of Ukrainian people, but also NATO at large.
I'm curious how much you see the situation in Gaza affecting this meeting of leaders. We had Niall Stanage ask John Kirby yesterday in the press conference about how Biden said his policy for peace in the Middle East is one of his great successes. And I think that surprised a lot of people. When Kirby was asked, would he label the Gaza policy a success, Kirby kind of stumbled, talked a lot about civilian deaths. It seems that this is a very sensitive topic for the administration. Do we see this coming up at this meeting of NATO?
Sure. I think that's wise, too, to talk about what's in the background here as we're really focusing on the NATO allegiance and European defense. How do external realities actually impact that? And you mentioned the wars in the Middle East, and we also have Indo-Pacific rivals. And so all of those things are in the background. That's one of the reasons Concerned Veterans for America is more, let's say, advocating for a strong European alliance, because the stronger the European allies are, 32 countries that can share the burden of defense equitably, the stronger they are and the less the United States has to bear that burden, the more we can impact other regions. So does it affect us? Absolutely. It's in the background. It's going to be part of the discussion. But there again, that makes the point that we ought to be asking commitment from our European allies.
Yeah, when you talk to many Americans, regardless of their political stances on other issues, if they're Republican or Democrat, so many Americans take the view that the U.S. government is over-involved in world affairs, in other governments, in conflicts in Europe, in the Middle East, and elsewhere, that our tax dollars are being spent on these conflicts, and that being invested in them is not doing a lot of good for U.S. security or for, frankly, improving the situation in those regional conflicts. You know, that's a view that a lot of Americans have that is, I think, less popular among policymakers and policy elites. You know, it's something various candidates run on, again, right and left, and then I think don't necessarily deliver on those promises. Given the populist mood, the anti-elite mood in not just the U.S. but in Europe, where we're seeing an anti-incumbency streak. In some cases, it's benefiting the right. In some cases, it's benefiting the left. But there's a lot of frustration, I think, with business as usual. And business as usual has been involvement and interventionism. Is there any pressure being put on world leaders to, I guess, to not do business as usual?
Well, I really appreciate that, because there is a growing consensus, both with the citizenry in the heartland of America, but also with some of our representatives in the lawmaker strata, that what we've done in the past is not working, whether it's the endless war campaigns of Iraq and Afghanistan, and again, veterans like myself who have watched the policymakers commit us to years and years and years of spending, and profligate spending at that, without having a clear objective at the end, and then walking away watching the disasters like we saw in Afghanistan, and as we watched Iraq turn back over to predominantly Shia interest in the military or in the government there. So we have the right to ask that question. You mentioned that there needs to be a pushback, or there ought to be a counter. There is one growing, but I'll warn this, that yesterday during the NATO Summit, the Foreign Policy magazine held close by the Gallup building, Chairman McCall, who represents a certain block of the Republican wing, had talked about the pressure he anticipated from lawmakers receiving back in their districts from the community. And he mentioned that it wasn't as bad as he thought. In other words, they were passing more supplementals and more aid for Ukraine, anticipating that citizens would be upset with that, but then not feeling that back in their districts. It meant to him, at least as I understood it, that this was an encouragement for them to go further. So the real point here, and again, we represent folks all over America that are advocating for, let's be smart with our policy, let's prioritize what our commitments are, and let's ensure that Europe is strong enough to make the most formidable defense in Europe they can, and it doesn't rely on a lopsided relationship that the United States is the first and the foremost to the fight.
Now, NATO funding and contributions became a key focus of the debate between Trump and Biden. Trump sort of hit back, saying we're not getting equal contribution from all of the members. It's true that some are falling short of that 2% of GDP contribution target, but I think we can't expect everyone to be contributing the same amount as the United States, given that everyone's GDP looks differently, especially compared to the United States. Do you think contributions will become a topic because of pressure from Trump and the Republicans?
Well, every president, for going back to Eisenhower, has really made the same commitment that European allies have not been all the way up to the 2% mark, and that mark is 2% of their gross domestic product. So it allows for smaller countries with smaller economies to contribute up to that point. And the good news here is that in the last 10 years, we've seen that go from about 2 or 3 countries meeting that mark in 2014 to this year, we anticipate about 23 European countries meet that 2% mark. And in addition to that, NATO has now become more, let's say, advocates of using that percentage, 20% of their military spending rather than the civil spending. What that really means to soldiers like myself is that they increase the production of their militaries. So that enforces readiness for other allies in Europe who are right now not ready to handle this by themselves. But as we continue leading in this conversation, that's where we need to go if we want NATO to make it from 75 to, say, 100. That's another 25 years. The only way we get there is if our allegiance shares in the burden equitably.
Yeah, of course, there are some people on the right and the left right now that I think are very much questioning whether NATO is still a necessary organization, given that things have changed dramatically since the Cold War. Some things have changed, not everything. There's still an antagonistic relationship with Russia out there, although some people point to tactics that NATO has pursued, wondered if that, if it's a both sides kind of situation, which obviously does not excuse the invasion that Russia launched, but the pressure put on them by NATO may have helped get us in this tit-for-tat situation. But it sounds like you're taking the position that in order for the U.S. to be less involved, to be less of a world police, to be more focused on our own concerns, having NATO still exist and having Europe be involved in it and be providing that strength rather than the U.S. is the way forward.
Yeah, in fact, you bring up some great points. One about how NATO has potentially impacted this, and we can look at the current CIA director, William Burns, who mentioned during the 2008 summit that having NATO expanded to Ukraine would be a red line for Putin. Now, you could argue that one way or another, but we are in now a proxy war with Ukraine. And so the effectiveness of the defensive alliance is only going to be strengthened when the countries, the 32 countries that participate in their defense, are at a point where they can deter Russia without the United States. That doesn't mean we're not a partner. It just means the strength really is going to be bolstered by their commitments to that GDP spending, which then, of course, allows the United States to prioritize our own spending. That's necessary at this moment.
Wise words. Jason Beardsley, thank you so much for joining Rising, and of course, thank you for your service.
Thank you for having me.